All right, so the last section of the fossil fuels chapter is talking about energy efficiency and conservation. So basically, how can we keep getting better with what we have? So there's a difference between these two things, between efficiency and conservation. Efficiency describes the ability to obtain a given amount of output while using less energy input. So basically, we need to be able to get more energy out of the same amount of input. And this results from improved technology. So, for example, this would be fuel efficient light bulbs or fuel efficient cars. So we're putting in the same amount of energy input while getting a greater output, increasing the amount of energy we can get from the same amount of fossil fuels. Conservation describes the practice of reducing wasteful or unnecessary energy use. And this comes from behavioral choices. So instead of four people driving separately to go to the same spot, you can drive together and use less gas, that sort of thing, a behavioral choice. But because efficiency allows us to reduce energy use, efficiency is a primary means of conservation as well. But there is a difference between the two. So efficiency and conservation bring benefits. They help us to waste less and to reduce environmental impact, and additionally helps us to, okay, so we're not only fixing the problem, we're wasting less and helping the environment, we're also not having to deal with many of these really tough social issues and divisive ideas that come up about how to get more fossil fuels, about the cost of fossil fuels, and about drilling in the Arctic, and about fracking and all of that. Suddenly we don't have to worry about that if we reduce our fossil fuel usage. We're done with those divisive social debates. So Americans use far more energy per person than people in most other nations. So this is a graph of our per capita energy consumption over time since 1950 through 2010. So India, so this is current over here. India is down here, then Indonesia, then Mexico. The world average is right there. China, UK. The world average is probably so low when all these others are so high. Remember, there's so many people in India, and China's not far off from the average either. Then here's some Western European countries, Japan, Russia. We're right here. Saudi Arabia is right above us, and Canada's way above us. So many European nations have similar standards of living, but use far less energy per capita, which tells us that we could reduce our energy consumption without significantly impacting our quality of life. It's not like we need to go carless and live in huts and whatever else. We can live the way we live now, just use less energy while we do it. And our per person energy use has declined over the past 3 decades. So you can actually see that we're lower now than we were. We rose and then dropped a little bit, definitely less since 1980. And this has been during a period of sustained economic growth. So we are still growing, and we have been doing a good job at lowering our usage. Then there's this thing called energy intensity, which is the energy use per dollar of GDP. So this is comparing how much money your country makes with how much energy you're using. So lower energy efficiency indicates a greater efficiency in electricity use. And so during the same time period that we were just talking about, the US cut its energy intensity in half. So we are, basically that shows that we are getting twice as much economic bang per energy buck. So we are making improvements. But then we can also talk about how personal actions, which involve efficient technologies, are 2 different routes to conservation. So we have choices as an individual, like choosing to drive less, choosing to turn down thermostats, turn off lights, buy energy efficient appliances. All these things are choices an individual can make to reduce or to conserve energy. Then as a society, we can do things like developing technologies and strategies to make energy consuming devices and processes more efficient, as more than 2/3 of the fossil fuel energy we use is lost as heat. So if we can reduce that amount that's being lost as heat, then we can be more efficient. So we have what's called cogeneration, which is a process in which excess heat produced during the generation of electricity is captured and used to heat nearby workplaces and homes and to produce other kinds of power. So basically, this heat is lost, right? We're losing 2/3 of energy as heat, so that these things are going to be hot. If we can capture that heat and channel it to heat homes or other workplaces, then we don't need to burn more fossil fuels to heat those ones. So this is actually how your heater in a car works. The hot air that blows out of your vents is air that's being pushed past the engine and heating up that way. So rather than expending energy to heat the air in your car. It just takes some of the energy that's being lost off the engine anyways. So some other options are improved design and insulation can also help to reduce heat loss from buildings. So if we have better insulation, then you won't need to heat your house as much because the heat will stay trapped inside and the cold will stay outside. And then vice versa, in the summer, the heat will stay outside. And if you do need to use your AC, then it will stay inside and you won't waste as much. Then we can also do things like passive solar design, so using solar energy, better insulation, a building's location, vegetation around it, and even the color of the roof. Because remember, a lighter color roof will reflect energy as opposed to a dark roof, which would absorb the energy. Then those two little bullet points at the bottom are talking about how recent regulations have restricted how much power devices can use while in standby, which is sometimes called vampire energy loss. So if you have something plugged into the wall, or just something that runs off batteries and you're not using it, it is still using energy. So that's why it's called vampire energy loss, and that is a complete waste of energy because it's not being used for anything. So there's been some restrictions to lower those on new products. And then we also talked about the Energy Star program, where the EPA made this program where it labels refrigerators, dishwashers, and other appliances for their efficiency if they meet certain efficiency standards. And studies show that energy savings on utility bills from people who have Energy Star appliances have readily offset the higher prices of these new appliances. It's a new technology. It might cost more, but the amount that you save per month in electricity or gas bills makes them worth it. And the EPA estimates that if all households purchased energy efficient appliances, the annual energy expenditure would fall by $200 billion. So that's a lot. So then we also have automobile conservation as a key to conservation or fuel conservation. So some ways to conserve are things like electric cars, electric gasoline, hybrid cars, plug-in hybrids, and hydrogen fuel cells. So current US hybrid models are actually at 50 miles per gallon, which is a lot higher than an average gasoline car, and fully electric cars actually get 100 miles per gallon. So those are good ways to conserve. So in 1970, there was an OPEC embargo, and basically OPEC is the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, and they really, really raised their in 1973, they decided to stop selling oil to the U.S. As an issue with the Arab countries and us. And so then we were in a major oil shortage. So the U.S. increased its corporate average fuel efficiency standards. So basically it was a mandated increase in fuel efficiency of cars because we didn't have enough oil to keep all the cars going. So the average, so that was in 1973. And fuel prices fell over the next few decades, but these standards were not increased further until 2007 because gasoline wasn't as expensive, so we didn't need to keep getting more efficient. So there was a time in like the late 90s, early 2000s when SUVs and big cars were really popular, like Hummers driving around, which use up a ton of gas. So the average MPG actually fell from 1987 to 2004 by almost a gallon. But then in 2007, Congress mandated that car makers raise their MPG to 35 miles per gallon by 2020, which is next year, which is crazy. So now we need to have a 35 mile per gallon average. But there was this issue during the recession where a lot of manufacturers needed a bailout from the government. They were all going bankrupt. And so Obama did do the bailout with these companies, but he made them raise the fuel economy standards to be 54.5 miles per gallon by 2025. So I'm not sure how that's going, but that was a big deal. And then one more thing about about conserving auto fuel is there's this thing that Obama and Congress came up with in 2009, formerly called the Consumer Assistance to Recycle and Save Cars. It's the acronym, the ACT. But basically it's called Cash for Clunkers, if you've ever heard of that. What it did was it offered an incentive of $3,500 to $4,500 per old car that you turn in to be recycled that can go towards buying a new one. That way we're getting rid of those cars that are like 15 miles per gallon, just wasting fuel to get one that's much more fuel efficient. So that was super successful. It's estimated that 824 million gallons of gasoline are being saved as a result of the Cash for Clunkers program. So we need both conservation and renewable energy. So we've talked about conservation here, but that's still not going to get us far enough. So a combination of energy efficiency and conservation efforts is essential to creating a sustainable future. And so basically, if we went through all of these things, it'd be the same as finding a new oil reserve. If we went through making things more efficient and conserving, it would be as if we found a whole huge new oil reserve. And so some estimates hold that the US could save 6 million barrels of oil a day, more than could be gained from Canada's oil sands. So Canada's oil sands were one of our new sources of unconventional fossil fuels, and we can actually save more than that whole thing if we go through with these conservation and efficiency measures.